Hello, everybody. This is Jeremy. I'm here to give my presentation for Relation of Q to Consequence and Avoidance Learning by Garcia and Koelling. Basically, it sounds more complicated than it is, but basically what Garcia and Koelling did was they used rats, and they were basically looking at differences between different reinforcers that would increase the avoidance behavior. They used, reinforcers like radiation or electric shock. And basically, we're looking at the differences between these two to see how it would change their willingness to drink from their water spout in their chamber. And they did a couple different things, so let's get into it. So I think before we get into the real meat and potatoes of the article itself, I think it's important for us to do a quick refresher on just the basics of classical conditioning and just kind of, get ourselves up to speed with what we're going to be looking at. So in classical conditioning, you have a neutral stimulus that triggers no response. Then during conditioning, you have your neutral stimulus, and then you pair that with an unconditioned stimulus, which triggers an unconditioned response. So you pair the neutral with the unconditioned, which will elicit an unconditioned response. And then through enough pairing, that neutral stimulus will now become the conditioned stimulus, which will trigger the conditioned response. So I think we're all familiar with Pavlov's experiment with his dogs, where you have, a bowl of food, which is the unconditioned stimulus, which will trigger the unconditioned response. The dog will salivate. Then if you jump over to number 2, you have the bell, which is the neutral stimulus, and elicits no response. And then through repeated pairing of the tone of the bell with the food presented to the dog, you pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, triggering the unconditioned response. And then through repeated pairing, eventually you get to square 4, where the tone of the bell itself will condition or has conditioned the dog to salivate. So the bell is now the conditioned stimulus, and the salivation is the conditioned response. So since this article deals a lot with taste aversion, which is a form of classical conditioning, you eat something, you get sick, you avoid eating this food again in the future. It's a learned response to eating spoiled or toxic food. Many of us might be familiar with this, if you have a memory of, maybe you drank this certain type of alcohol or liquor and you drank too much of it and you got sick, you got very nauseous or maybe threw up. That's taste aversion. Maybe now to this day, if you smell that type of alcohol or if you see that type of alcohol, it might make you nauseous. Or, if someone brings up that type of alcohol and says, oh, let's drink this, you might make a face or go, ew, no way. So, that's taste aversion. You've been classically conditioned to, resent that type of alcohol. Or, similar thing to food. Maybe you ate a certain type of food that got you sick, and now to this day, that type of food you try to avoid. So if you look at the little, image reel down the bottom there, you have the neutral stimulus, which is the cake. The cake itself doesn't elicit any kind of a response. But then you pair the cake with the bacteria there, the bacteria in the cake, which will make you sick. The bacteria would be the unconditioned stimulus. So you pair the cake and that bacteria, the neutral stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, that will elicit the unconditioned response, which is that you will get sick in the middle there. And then toward the end, you see, the little lady is now really resenting to eat cake or look at cake and doesn't want to be near the cake because she's been classically conditioned through the pairing of the cake and the bacteria to avoid that cake. So that's taste aversion. Then the conditioned response is the avoidance, and the conditioned stimulus is now the cake. So just as some background information about Garcia's discovery, this was actually an accidental discovery. Garcia was working with rats and actually looking at how the radiation had an effect on rats, using different radiation techniques as a form of defense against living creatures. So he was testing in rats using radiation, and what Garcia discovered was that he would place the rats in the radiation chamber, and he noticed that through exposure to the radiation, they would eventually avoid drinking from their plastic water spouts. But however, they would drink from a glass water spout. So this led Garcia to believe that something to do with the plastic in the water spout must have given the water some kind of a funny taste, and that had classically conditioned the rats to believe that the plastic water spout was causing them, because what radiation does is it causes you to feel nauseous, like sick to your stomach, exposure to high levels of radiation. So he started to believe that the rats had been classically conditioned a taste aversion, believing that plastic taste in the water spout had basically caused them to avoid the water spout altogether, because they had been conditioned to associate the stomach ache and the nausea from the radiation with the plastic taste of the water spout, which they didn't get from the glass water spout because there was no taste there. So this led Garcia to basically want to look at this process more in-depthly. So he began running different experiments, kind of looking at what was happening with these rats. So basically, he flavored water using saccharin, which is kind of like a sugar. It's an artificial sweetener. It tastes really sweet. And he refers to this saccharin water as a gustatory stimulus. And a gustatory stimulus is just anything that has to do with taste. Anything concerned with taste is a gustatory stimulus. So he used this saccharin water, and he got one group of rats where he would, basically the rats would drink this saccharin water from their spout, and shortly after he would hit them with radiation that would cause them to feel the nausea. Then he had a control group of rats that they would drink from the water, and they were given no consequence. They'd drink the saccharin water, and nothing would happen to them. And then later, he would test these rats again, and what he noticed was that the rats that had received the radiation would strongly suppress drinking any of the saccharin water, whereas the control group showed no suppression at all. They'd drink the saccharin water without any avoidance at all, whereas the rats that had received the radiation and then the nausea basically were avoiding this saccharin water. So basically what you can see here is that, the rats drink the saccharin water, which is just a neutral stimulus, and then that gets paired with the nausea, that gets paired with the radiation, which is the unconditioned stimulus. So the neutral stimulus is the saccharin water, gets paired with the radiation, which is the unconditioned stimulus, which the radiation triggers the nausea, which is the unconditioned response. And then through conditioning, now just the water alone, the neutral stimulus, has become the conditioned stimulus. The smell of the saccharin is enough to trigger the conditioned response, which is basically to avoid the water. And the effects of this conditioning were so strong that the aversion of the saccharin persisted for over a month, despite the fact that it was acquired after only one pairing of saccharin with radiation, which is, pretty surprising. But I'm sure, as most of you know, with any of you with the whole food or drinking where, you got sick that one time was all it took for you to avoid that type of alcohol or that beverage or that food for an indefinite amount of time. So that brings us to the article itself, Garcia and Koelling. A lot of people refer to this as tasty, bright, and noisy water, so we'll see why they call it that. The rats were given the saccharin-flavored water, the gustatory stimulus, but when they would drink from this water, a nearby light and a clicking tone, which is an audiovisual stimulus, were also activated when they would drink from the spout. So the rats would drink from the spout, they'd get the saccharin water, but as they licked the spout, a light nearby would go on and a tone would click. So you can see the pairing starting there. The rats were divided into two groups, either a pain or a nausea group. Basically, one group would receive electric shock that would induce pain when they would drink from the water spout, and another group would receive radiation, which would induce nausea, shortly after they would drink from their water spout. But all the rats in both groups would receive all three of the conditions of the light, the saccharine water, and the tone. So hence tasty, bright, and noisy water, because all the rats would drink, the light and the tone would sound, except one group of rats would get the electric shock, and the other group of rats would shortly after drinking get the radiation, which would cause the nausea, and the shock would cause the pain. And what Garcia and Koelling found was that subsequent to the conditioning, after they had, gone through the drinking the water, the light, the noise, and then either the shock or the radiation, the group of rats exposed to the radiation would only avoid drinking the water if it contained saccharin. However, these same rats that were avoiding the saccharin water would drink plain water with no saccharin. After the saccharin had gotten out of the water, they would drink the plain water regardless of whether the light or the tone were on. So if they got radiation, that the pairing of the light and the tone was basically meaningless. It was only the smell of the saccharin that would cause them to avoid the water. However, conversely, the other group of rats that were electrically shocked when they would drink the water would only avoid the water when the light and the tone were present. However, these same rats would not discriminate between plain or flavored water when the light and the tone were not present. So they basically, the discrimination was dependent entirely on the light and the tone being on or off, and it didn't matter whether the water smelled like saccharin or smelled like plain, or there was no smell. Either smelled like saccharin or there was no smell. It was entirely dependent on the light and the tone, whereas the radiation group was entirely dependent on just the smell of the saccharin. So here we have the picture, just more of a visual look at what's going on here. If you look on the left side, you have the radiation column, where you have the light and the noise. The rat drinks the tasty water. Then, shortly after, they receive the radiation, which is also important because it shows that even the radiation doesn't need to happen simultaneously as drinking the water. The radiation can even happen after drinking the water, and the rat will still be conditioned to associate that nausea with the tasty water. Then, if you go down to square C, you see that the rat avoids the tasty water. The rat avoids the tasty water, light or no light, just because it smells of saccharin. That the only reason they're avoiding the water is because of the saccharin smell. And then you go down to D, where the rat will drink the plain water because there's no saccharin in it, even if the light is on or off. So that brings us over to the other column, the shock column. You look at square E. The rat is being conditioned to associate the bright light and the noise with the water. The rat gets shocked when it drinks the water. No bright, then square G. If the light and the noise are off, the rat will drink the water. Then you go down to square H. If the light and the tone are going, the rat will avoid the water. And that says plain water, but plain water or saccharin water, it'll avoid, no matter what, that rat that received the shock is going to avoid the water, plain or saccharin, as long as that light and the noise are present. So we'll just go to the recap and the conclusion. So you had one group of rats were conditioned to associate the light and the noise with the pain caused by the electric shock. Then you have the other group of rats were conditioned to associate flavored water with nausea by inducing radiation. And the big idea to take away from this article, what makes this article important, is that they found that they couldn't swap the conditioned stimuli and still create an association. So basically, they couldn't swap out the stimuli. The rats, they could not create an association between noise and nausea, and they could not create an association between flavored water and pain. The only associations they could create were the two first associations, the light and the noise with the pain caused by the electric shock, or the flavored water with the nausea caused by inducing the radiation. But the pain caused by the electric shock could not be associated with the flavored water, and the nausea by inducing radiation could not be associated with the light and the noise. So what this is called is biological preparedness or preparedness, or basically just there's biological boundaries, or they're biologically susceptible to following that train of association where light noise leads to pain, and from the electric shock, and flavored water leads to nausea. That's the only association they could create. Avoidance, so the last bullet there is avoidance due to nausea is preferential to the ingestion of a substance, whereas avoidance due to pain is preferential to an audiovisual stimulus. So the rats are basically, and this probably generalizes to most other animals, is that rats are basically susceptible, and they're bound to, anytime they ingest a substance and receive nausea, that association is made. But if they ingest a substance and receive pain from it, like an electric shock, they're much less likely to make that association between the nausea between the pain and the ingestion of a substance. They ingest a substance, feel pain, they won't make an association. And conversely, if there's an audiovisual stimulus present, like the light and the tone, and then shortly sometime after they feel nauseous, they won't make that association. They won't say that light, they won't feel that the light, they basically won't learn that the light and the tone is what is making them feel that nausea later on. They won't make any association there. So basically the main idea of the article is that, animals are bound to certain types of associations. There are rules to classical conditioning based on biological factors when it comes to which consequences are paired with which cues. So that goes back to the title, relation of cue to consequence in avoidance learning. When the rats are going through avoidance learning, there is a relation between the cue and the consequence, where certain reinforcers are preferential to certain responses. So that's basically the whole article in a nutshell. I hope that I gave you a pretty good understanding of what happened here, and I tried to put it as simple as possible. Just those are my links there to where I got a lot of my information from and some of my pictures. So I hope that was helpful. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Everybody stay healthy. Hope everyone's doing their best to practice social distancing and the whole 9 yards with this coronavirus thing. So thank you very much.